Okay, so here we're going to be talking about variable scope. We're not going to spend too much time on this, but it's something important to understand, and it will cause us some problems a little bit, I think. I've seen it cause some students problem, and so we'll kind of get into this and go over the basics, I suppose. So essentially, you can use the same variable in multiple cases and the same variable name, and it will be represent like a different variable. And if I use a variable in a function, if I create a variable in a function, I can't access that variable in another function. So variables have something called scope, which is like the area in which they are can be used. Okay, and so we have a type of variable called a global variable, where it has a global scope where it works for everything. So with this variable x, if I declare it outside of a function, that means it has a global scope. I can use it anywhere. Okay, if I declare a variable inside of a function, that means I can only use it within that function. And that's kind of the rules. And even if, like, let's say that we have an if statement. So if I have an if true whatever, and then I have some kind of variable that I create in here, I can't use that variable y here. If I said like x equals y, if I try to do this, this is going to give me an error. Okay, I think, yes. So it gives me an error because it says line 16 error. Oh, looks like I'm missing a semicolon here too. But it says line 16 error, y was not declared in this scope. So y belongs to the scope of this if statement. So anytime we have a set of brackets, that is where that variable belongs to when it's declared. So y, the scope of y was inside of this if statement. Okay? If instead I took this variable y and I declared it over here inside the setup, this is a different function than the loop, and so we would get another error again, because the variable, we'd say the variable y has not been declared in this scope, and so in the scope of loop it was not declared. If I instead put this right here, now if I run it, it's going to work. Okay, because now the y has been declared in the scope that I used it. Okay, so let's remove that. And we have an interesting scenario here where we have declared this global variable x equals 0. We've then declared this variable x equals 7 in the setup scope here, and we print the value of x, and then here down the loop we print the value of x again. Okay, and so we're gonna print this. I want you to think about what's gonna get printed by this one and what's going to get printed by this one. Okay, so in the case of this first one, we're going to print the value that we changed right here. So we changed x to be 7 there, and so this is going to print as 7. Okay, and because we declared x here, we declared it within this scope. Okay, and so this basically does something where it replaces this x for the setup function. And so now anytime we reference x in the setup function, we're talking about this one here that we made to be 7. Okay, and so anytime we reference it, it's going to be 7. And then coming down to here, when we reference x again, since this is out of the scope of the setup function, we will not be using the one we changed to 7. It will now have a value of 0. Okay, I think sometimes I get this stuff wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's what's going to happen here. Okay, so we run our simulation, we've got our serial monitor. Okay, we'll stop it, we'll run it again. So we get the 7, let me clear this. We get the 7 from the first one, and then the 0 from the loop. Okay, and so what happened again is inside the loop we created an instance, or like a new version of x, I suppose, and we set it to assign it the value 7, and we printed that value out. Once we left that setup, we were out of the scope of that x, and we have the regular x here. Okay, if instead I do this, I don't create a new variable there inside of setup, or I don't create like a version of x for that setup function, and so now we can see they both send the 7. Okay, so I get 7 from both. This one now has a 7 because I changed the value of 7 here. Okay, and so that was an interesting thing that maybe we weren't expecting, and it has entirely to do with variable scope. Okay, now let's say that I want to, we'll go ahead and declare the variable x right here. Okay, and we'll say int x equals 0. Okay, and we won't access x here, so we'll get rid of this line. We'll get rid of these 2 lines. Okay, and then what we'll do is, instead of this, we'll move this into our function here. Okay, and then we'll call here function 1. Okay, I start my simulation, and so we get an error here because it says x was not declared in the scope. And so we have this function in which we're referencing x, but because it wasn't declared in this function, it's only in this loop that's declared, we can't use it. Now, one thing we could do is we could actually pass that value of x, and then we could say int x to take it as an argument, and now it will work. Okay, and we look at our serial monitor, and you can see that it's going to print the number 0, yeah. So it's going to be printing a 0. Okay, and we'll shorten this delay so that we can see what's going on. On the other hand, instead of passing that as an argument, we can just make our own value of x. We'll call it int, so we'll say x equal to 5. Okay, and now it's going to be printing a 5. Alright, so even though we say here x is 0, trying to print the 5, didn't like that because I missed the semicolon. And now we can see that the serial monitor prints that value of 5 inside of this function. Okay, and so this, if on the other hand we were declared this variable x inside that function, and we tried to reference it here, again, we're going to get an error because we're outside of the scope. Okay, and so variables exist for the scope or the code block. So these brackets define a code block. They exist within that code block that they were defined in. And then we also have global variables in which they exist for all code blocks, right? So I can, if I have a global variable int x, I can then reference it anywhere. Okay, so this now fixes that problem because I have x that now can exist in any function. Okay, but if I don't have that global variable, then it's limited to the scopes of the functions in which it's defined. Okay, so this is a pretty high level concept, so hopefully it was making sense. And again, as always, if you have questions, definitely let me know, and hopefully this wasn't too confusing for you.